Morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on wherever you are. Welcome to another Eye on Africa. My name is Awasar. I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center at Michigan State University. So Eye on Africa is our weekly speaker series. I'm very delighted today to have our speaker, Professor Maano Ramutsindela from Cape Town. So a brief introduction, and then he'll join us and start his talk. So Professor Maano Ramutsindela holds a PhD in geography from Royal Holloway, University of London, where he studied as a Canon Collins Scholar. He is professor in the Department of Environmental and Geographical Science and Dean of Science at the University of Cape Town. Professor Ramutsindela held the Mandela Mellon Fellow of WEB Institute, Harvard, the Distinguished Herbert Humphrey Chair of International Studies at Macalester College, St. Paul, Minnesota, and visiting fellow of the Institute of Advanced Studies at the University of Western Australia. He is the author of Transfrontier Conservation in Africa at the Confluence of Capital, Politics, and Nature. So the book came out in 2007. His most recent main publications include Africa and the Sustainable Development Goals, co-edited with David Meckler. And that one is 2020. And Environmental Governance and the Remaking of the African State with Bram Bushker, Oxford Encyclopedia of African Politics, that was in 2009. Greening Africa's Borderlands, the Symbiotic Politics of Land and Borders in Peace Park, Political Geography, 2017, and Green Violence, Rhino Poaching, and the War to Save Southern Africa, Southern Africa's Peace Park. And that one was with Bram Bushner and African Affairs, 2016. So welcome, Professor Ramutsindela. We're very happy to have you here.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm delighted to be hosted by the center that I've always desired to visit at some point, but that's not going to happen under these conditions.
Yeah, next time.
I still feel I'm giving this talk at the university, at the center, though I'm located and seated in Cape Town at the moment. And I really want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of my research with the audience, people who attend your seminar series. You know, it's always an opportunity for me to share, but also to learn through the question and answers that will come out of this talk. So I'm also thankful for people who have joined us to listen to this talk. I'm going to talk about Africa's borderlands and how they relate to the current rise in environmentalism. You could think of environmentalism just as ideas about looking after the environment, but as I'm going to show, it has very much to do with people as well. So I thought this is an opportunity for me to think through Africa's borderlands and how they link to ideas about the environment. We all know that Africa's borders have been discussed for a very long period of time. And the discussions about African borders were mostly about how they were created by colonialists. But what I want to do in this talk is to link these borderlands and environmentalism. So I want to move away from our preoccupation with African borders as colonial legacy, but take that legacy forward to see what it does when it meets environmentalism. And I'm going to present borders as ideas. We know how African borders are marked. They are marked by fences, and not all borders are marked by fences, but we do see fences around. And there have been talks of building walls to mark the borders, especially between in East Africa, between Kenya and Somalia. Some borders are marked by rivers. So these physical attributes of borders have perhaps made us to think of them as entities, as features on the landscape. But they actually start from being ideas. They are ideas about the continent. Those who drew these borders had ideas about the continent, and these ideas were materialized by some of the borders that we have today, and that's where the legacy is. But the ideas were not just about the continent as a place; they were also about people on the continent, how they should be grouped into different entities, be it through ethnicity, in some cases race, and language groups. So there have been different experiments to try and group people. And that grouping was facilitated by the idea of the border. So the border comes in as a consequence of ideas that are being pursued on the continent. And I also see borders on the continent as more of institutions. So once these borders were created, they impact on how people are managed. We now have got nation states that are reinforced by having borders. And we have to manage these spaces because they are unsettled or surrounded by borders. But we also know that borders have created some practices, especially in people living along these borders. They've had to develop certain practices in order to survive. Historians have documented some of these evolutions of borders and how people have tried to behave in ways that challenge the very same idea of the border. So if we look at borders from this perspective, we would then understand why these ideas also chime with those of the environment. I'm using environmentalism here to refer to ideas about how to protect the environment, ideas about how people should live in relation to nature. And much of environmentalism has to do with these two elements: how to change the relationship between people and the environment on one hand, and how to promote certain policies that will protect the environment. And this has emerged in different forms. The clearest of them is the national parks that we have around the world, which would mean you set aside land in order to protect the environment. But environmentalism is also action-oriented. It's not simply ideas that are being pursued in an abstract form. It has to be realized by actually doing things on the ground. And most of the NGOs go all out to do those things. And that's important to know. The question that interests me is what enables these actions? What are the conditions on the continent that enable particular actions that are related to ideas about the environment, that are related to ideas about people and how they should relate to the environment? So this for me it's an intriguing question, which I want to share with you today. I'm more interested in the convergence of ideas of borders and ideas of the environment. I just drew a blank map, and it's, I'm showing a blank map. It doesn't mean I believe in empty land. I just wanted to make the graphic more simpler. And on one hand, we have got borders that are lived spaces. People who see their borders as important for their livelihoods. In places like West Africa, there are documented case studies of how people in Togo would negotiate prices. Depending on the tax on one side of the border, they will negotiate that. So the border becomes quite important in the livelihood of people who need to negotiate their own lives. Sad as it is that the borders have divided people, we find that people living along these borders have used them to reorganize themselves, as scholars will call them, borderlanders. They've organized themselves around these borders to make sure that their lives are not necessarily determined forever by these borders. And in some cases, these borders have been very much useful in sustaining some of the economies that we see along the borders. I know that when we think of the economies along the borders, it's almost like talking about illegal activities. And I'm not necessarily referring to those, smuggling of goods and things across the borders, but that's also an economy that challenges other form of economies. What I'm referring to here is the ability of people to negotiate their economies, to negotiate and create markets along the borders in ways that they can bypass some of the regulations. As I'm going to show later, the center is so far away that it can't regulate some of these things. And I also then look at environmentalism as living landscapes. So these are not, these ideas of the environment are not necessarily referring to non-living things. People who are called environmentalists, conservationists in particular, are interested in conserving the living, the living things. It could be the fisheries, the wildlife, the forests, and so these are living landscapes, and they've always been living landscapes for people who had some relationships with the environment that we're losing as we succumb to the juggernaut of industrialism, and also now at the moment succumbing to the capitalist economy. But the living landscapes themselves were able to sustain generations of people. But the way they related to that environment is now being changed under the ideas of protecting nature. It's almost like in Africa, you need to protect nature against people. As some have argued, we're trying to protect Africa against Africans themselves. And so these are the ideas that I find interesting to bring together and begin to understand what's happening. Now, I've got a sort of a simple argument to make, which is that African borders have proved over time to be a fertile ground for environmentalism. And I want to pause here and think whether this is unique to Africa. And my answer will be, there are some features in Africa that make environmentalism thrive. And Africa's borderlands are not necessarily unique in all forms. There are similarities with other borders around the world. But what is important, and the point I want to make in this talk, is that these African borderlands have become fertile grounds for environmentalism because of certain qualities of these borderlands. There are some attributes that are very strong in African borderlands that perhaps are not as visible in other places. So I'm going to just look at three reasons why African borderlands are important for environmentalism, or how environmentalism has taken advantage of African borderlands to promote certain ideas. And the first reason is the land tenure regimes that we have on the continent. We know that in much of Africa, the colonial legacy of land, it's a reality. When colonialism took away the land from the inhabitants of the continent, when colonialists took away the land from the inhabitants of the country, they simply turned them into tenants of the state. So if one goes back to the creation of the colonial state, what happened to people who lived in those places that became colonies? They just became tenants of the state. And up to today, we still have many countries where this is a reality. And because they're tenants of the state, they become vulnerable to some of these ideas, as I will just show in a minute. But the colonial legacy is also important in considering how we ended up with very weak land rights in many parts of the continent. Some of these land rights are undefined. People are living on the land, they're using the land, but they actually don't know who owns the land. And that ownership has not been resolved. Ownership of land, perhaps I need to explain what my concept of land is here. It's not simply the terrestrial part of it, but land is more than just the surface on which people build their houses. It's more than the fields that they plow. It encompasses the cosmologies, how people relate to land and to others through land. And if you don't have very strong land rights, you destroy all of these things. So post-independence has not resolved the land question in part of the world where I'm located in Southern Africa. That is still a very difficult terrain to resolve. And countries that have tried to institute processes of land reform have not made the kind of progress that was expected of them. And this is very surprising, because land was crucial and also critical to the struggles against colonialism. It was important for organizing people to rise up. And yet it has retreated after independence in terms of how those in power see the importance of land to people. And a couple out of books, one can put as many books as possible, but the land question has not been resolved. And in Southern Africa, the two countries that stand out on the land question are basically Zimbabwe and South Africa. And they are in opposite directions. They all started using the same land policies, directions, with, of course, the exception of restitution in South Africa. But what has happened over time is that they followed divergent areas, divergent directions, with Zimbabwe having a fast track land reform, which has created the kinds of economic problems that we witness in the country today. And I'm not suggesting that all that we see in Zimbabwe is a result of the land reform that the country followed. There are political dynamics, as we can see even today. So my interest in the land question here is not so much about the process itself, but how the land question then links up with the environmentalism. So what happens when people's land rights are not secured? The resources on which they depend for their livelihoods are also not secured. So because their land rights have not been secured even after independence, not everywhere, in some cases they have been secured. There have been some progress in confirming customary land rights in places like Botswana. But the critical question is that the ownership of the resources has not been clearly defined because the land rights are weak. So people don't have the rights over the land on which they live. Now, for environmental ideas, that's a good thing, because you have the land that is not clearly defined in terms of land ownership, and this means you can grab that land quite quickly. Much of the land remains in the hands of the state. which means that the state can always use that land for whatever purpose it has. In terms of environmentalism, much of the land has been taken away to promote environmental protection. There have been a massive rise in the number of protected areas. So if one were to go back to the earlier protected areas in the 1920s and check the number of protected areas over time, they have increased, and they are not all around the borders. I need to make that qualification. But what I'm interested in is this land which is along the borders, which is not well defined in terms of ownership, and how that makes it possible for people who promote ideas of the environment to grab that land and use it for environmental purposes. So much of the land, the green grabbing, has taken place because people cannot negotiate. They don't have the powers to push back in legal ways, in legal means. Some of the entrepreneurs who are involved in taking away the land for conservation purposes. And this is also very difficult terrain because we are all worried about climate change, environmental change, and so it has become the task of humanity to look after the environment. And so if there are those who take advantage of weak land rights and take the land away to make it a protected area, we still think that they're doing a good thing for the world. And so this is where the morality of environmentalism trump over the morality of land rights. People have to sacrifice their land rights for the common good, but nothing comes back to them to compensate in meaningful ways for their contribution to that common good. What we're beginning to witness, especially in the borderlands, is that African borders are becoming more mobile. And this perhaps is a result of, again, environmental ideas. This is a map of Tanzania. This is the border of Tanzania, and in between you have got Mozambique. So what is happening between Tanzania and Mozambique is it's a creation of wildlife management areas. And I was grateful for Christine Noel, who shared this map with me. And this picture is quite telling about what is happening with land and conservation. So the areas that we see in between here, and this is in the Sulu Niassa corridor. So the idea is to connect Tanzania and Mozambique, to extend the Sulu Game Reserve into Mozambique. And what then you do is to create wildlife management areas in between in order to create that passage for the wildlife. But what makes this possible is because people don't have any ownership of land there. They cannot resist this kind of programs because the land on which they live belongs to the government. And because of that, it becomes very easy for people to negotiate to create these spaces with government because the land belongs to the government. Yet there are people who are using the land for their livelihood. And so you could imagine if these if these communities in the areas linking between Mozambique and Tanzania had land rights, they would demand compensation. If they were private landholders, they would not be moved around quite easily. They will have to be paid for their properties, but that doesn't happen to people who don't have those land rights. And that is the reason why I think we need to think of the ideas of the environment and land, and how that works out in the borderlands. Another example of mobile borders is it's Lesotho. I'm using examples that are close by here, close to me, because I've done some field work in these areas. So if you look at the Lesotho and the protected areas that they have there, okay, so this is the area which is a protected area, with Siklawatere National Park as a key area. But you have got, the rest of the country being used for something else. But these borders are not stable. What you have now is a suggestion. Look at the red line there. It's a suggestion of how big the conservation area should be. It's almost like more than half the country. Now these are ideas. This hasn't happened, but I want to bring this up because there are ideas about what should happen to a country like Lesotho. That you will be moving the border, this area here, to a place where almost more than half the country, it's protected areas. Again, what makes this possible is the land question, because people don't have the land rights to negotiate. And it's quite easy for governments to work with those who are promoting conservation to push for those. So African borders are moving, and the colonial borders might have stagnated in some ways, but we have got new borders that are moving, and they are moving very fast. And I'll come back to this point about the mobility of borders, and counterpose it with the stagnation of colonial borders that we all worry about. Okay, the second reason why African borders become fertile grounds for environmentalism, it's the socio-economic and political conditions. Now, if one looks at the concentration of poverty in many countries on the continent, whenever you go to the far-flung areas, that's where you've got extreme poverty, because there aren't economic activities. And of course, in the cities, you can have a very vibrant informal sector that sometimes is even bigger than the formal sector. But as you move to the far-flung areas, towards the borders, towards the edge of the state, you see this extreme poverty. I mean, the map that I showed you between Tanzania and Mozambique, when one travels to those places, poverty is just as it's just in your face, and I'm referring to poverty in the Western sense, I will call it that way. When you have got depressed economies and poverty, what do? You need to find ways of addressing that. and this is where environmentalism becomes important, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But these areas are also away from the centers of power. Now, when one looks at the borderlands and people who are living, in these remote areas, they are in many ways disconnected from the rhythm of the country, whether it is in political terms or economic terms. They're in some ways removed from the centers of these activities. What this imply is that you have people who cannot use the resources that are available at the big cities, in areas where they are where there's political power, to try and do something about their conditions. So they are vulnerable. But it is also, these areas are also very far from the reach of the state. Government officials, capital cities are always in the cities. Now, the attempt to change the capital city in Tanzania was an interesting development under Nyerere when he moved the capital city to Dodoma. But the city hasn't moved to Dodoma, even when the parliament has moved to that area. And so the economic activities that once established, they become very difficult to move around. So the capacity of the state to manage some of the people who are far away, it's a big issue. And this is where environmentalism becomes very useful, because environmentalism will address the depressed economies by bringing some ideas of development, especially through tourism, that the economy can be revived if the areas are conserved and we bring tourism. And there are indications that tourism was a very fast-growing industry. I just don't know now. I think it is taught in many places. So the idea of development that comes through environmentalism makes it possible for those areas to be turned into conservation areas. So the idea that you want to help people through protected areas, developing the tourism in those areas, has become central to policy in most countries. So they see tourism as important. And of course, there are many ministries of tourism that have also emerged. Initially, it was the Ministry of Environment. In some places, Environment and Tourism, and in other places, it is separated, because that's quite important. Now, what environmentalism does is that it also helps the state to extend its authority to those places. Tourism will require the building of roads, some infrastructure, and then the state can have access to those places, and there will be research in those places to understand the conditions of people, to understand conditions of the environment, and at least that informs the state about some of these areas. You will recall that in many places, when countries did not have the presence in the far-flung areas, they will just create a protected area, so that at least there's something there. But now in the current moment, the present moment, you have the state that extends its authority to the far-flung areas through this environmentalism. So environmentalism is helpful for the state. It helps the state to extend its hand into the areas where it couldn't before. The advantage the state has is that it doesn't have to pay for some of these things, because the protection of those areas through NGOs, through other forms of funding, will bring the resources that the state don't necessarily have to worry about, as long as the state creates the conditions for this to happen. So, and this is just an example, it's a village in Zambia, very close to the border with Namibia. And so I took this picture when doing field work in 2018. I was trying to understand some of the developments in the borders between Namibia, Zambia, Botswana, Angola, and Zimbabwe. But this is on the side of Zambia. Now, when environmentalists look at places like this, they think this is poverty. What can be done to help bring some development here? That's what they think about. Bring some wildlife there. And actually, in this area, there's been a big project to create a conservancy, and I'll show you some of the images. So you have the view of the village, and people begin to imagine the poverty, using poverty in their own terms, and then they think the only way to solve that, to improve the conditions of life, is to bring wildlife. And this is the plan. And I want to explain a bit what's going on here. So the place I've just showed you on the picture is this small place. Oops, sorry. That is the area that that is being used to link up. So the borders of Zambia, Botswana, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and Angola are being reworked anew using environmentalism as a key driver. Now, you have to redefine these borders to create connectivities of wildlife. And of course, in most of these maps, you don't see where the villages are, but we know there are people in all these spaces, even in some of the national parks. So if you think of Botswana, which is a bit far away, the delta. So I don't have a pointer with me here. So that's your Okavango Delta. Now there's attempt to link that, to link the movement of wildlife from Botswana to Zambia, okay, and from Namibia to Zambia, Angola, and so all these countries to have the movement of wildlife. How do you do this? Going back to the question of land, much of the land is owned by the state, so you can work programs with the state to say we want to do this. You can have development planning, which has been taking place in all these 5 countries, to ensure that you bring in activities that will improve the lives of people. The starting point is that we want to address poverty, and we can address this poverty through environmental means, meaning that we need to bring conservation areas into these spaces. And that's not necessarily a bad thing to do conservation. In these areas, if there's overpopulation of elephants in Botswana, which before the tragedy of the elephants that died more recently in Botswana, they wanted most of those elephants to move across to other places. And of course that's important, but I'm interested to understand what facilitates this. What is it in these borderlands areas that make this possible? And my view so far is that this is more possible because it is seen as addressing poverty. Actually, if you read documentations on this, the Okavango-Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area, the emphasis will be on trying to address poverty. And of course, nobody can say don't address poverty, because that's important for all of us to make sure that we improve the conditions of life of others. But how you do that becomes important for me. And so this is so the third reason that I think makes it possible for African borderlands to be a fertile ground for environmentalism is because the African borders themselves are not acceptable. There are historical legacy, there are colonial legacy that nobody wants to endorse. Of course, we know that the Organization of the African Unity, in its formation, they decided they'll keep the borders, and I think that debate has been going on since then. And so everybody condemns these borders. When people fight over the borders, Eritrea, the wars in the Horn over the borders was a very clear indication of how these borders are a problem. And so when you condemn the border, that's good for people thinking in environmental terms, because they say, well, actually, we don't need this border. But in their view, we don't need the border so they can create this. Okay, so forget about these are colonial borders. Let's cut the fences down. Let's remove everything. But that is not a critique of the colonial border. It is simply a logic by which one can push for environmental ideas. So while the border is being condemned, we think that's a good, if everybody's condemning this border, but we're condemning the border for different reasons. And from the environmental point of view, the condemnation of the border is a useful way of gaining political legitimacy, because you are seen to be doing away with colonial borders. But you're doing that for wildlife in this case. Going back to this map, it doesn't mean that people will be allowed to move across these borders just like the wildlife so far. There is a plan for a unique visa for tourists to be able to move across these borders, which was initiated between Zambia and Zimbabwe as an experiment. It did hit some problems, but I understand there are plans to revive it again. So this is still creating borders of some kind within this huge environmental estate, which is supposed to be borderless. But in these areas, you also have the multiplicities of laws. In the case of Zambia and Zimbabwe, Malawi, the fishing seasons are quite different. So you have to organize this transnational space by reworking the laws that govern the different countries, the laws that govern resources in different countries, the laws that govern the use of forests, the use of water in all these other countries. But you do so not because these laws are making the lives of people difficult. You do so in order to develop a law by which you can govern this transnational space. And here it's, let me go back to this map. So if you open up the space for the movement of, say, wildlife, what that means is that you cannot then claim this is my elephant. It belongs to all. Okay, it's no longer a nationalized entity. It's a territorialized entity in the sense of the nation state. It becomes transnational, and what that means in terms of ownership is you dilute the control of the governments over some of these resources. So you could just imagine if all animals are moving in between the spaces, nobody is going to claim this is my lion, this is my tiger. They belong all here, and you need a law that then will govern all these things. So my argument here would be that you do this so that you denationalize some of these resources, and here wildlife is a clear example. And once you've done that, the ownership becomes questionable. Then you open it up for others to exercise influence, if not control. Of course, the border is being condemned, and that's important. But that's not what is happening in reality. In reality, fences are being put up, and this is in the same area in Zambia. This fence was very fresh when I took this picture in 2018, because they were going to bring wildlife to this area to repopulate the place on the basis that these animals were here, some years back, and they disappeared, and we bring them back. But of course, one can't have the argument that says people were here long before and we want to bring them back. So there's still a differentiation in how the humans and non-humans are being treated in these spaces. So the point I want to make here is that while we think that the borders are being condemned, the fences are being cut down, and actually they are being erected, but for a different reason. So you condemn the colonial border, you cut down the fence, and you create a new fence that is important for conservation, still making sure that the areas are under conservation and people have no access to them. Now, these borderless landscapes are easier to create in these environments along the borders, because you, as I said, you have got weak land rights. The state has not had so much control over them, and whenever there is somebody who can do something along these borders, that's good for the state. The state is seen to be doing something. And I've already mentioned the point that they redefine ownership. And at some point we will not have statistics that will say there's the population of these kind of animals is so much in this country. As when the countries are working together, it will be a new form of statistics that we will need to generate. But what is important about this is it becomes the space for the eco-entrepreneurs. So the investment in these areas is not simply about the environment itself. It's not for the sake of the environment only, there's also to use the environment for profit making. And this is where eco-entrepreneurs find these spaces to be important, because they become useful for making business. And this is where capitalism thrives. The investment in these spaces, I would argue, has also very much to do with the business model of conservation that has emerged over time. And this conservation areas along the borders create a new model altogether, because you can visit more than one country all at once, and that is the idea. But if you want to control these areas, you also have to insert new legal regimes. And I think we still have to learn more about the new laws that are going to be governing these spaces in ways that perhaps we haven't imagined, because we're looking at them just as policies, but they will turn into legal instruments that will control these spaces. And we're beginning to see this whenever there is poaching, that the laws are being readjusted to allow this security, the policing from one country to have some effect on the other. You know, how they collaborate together. So you need to change some laws. What about investment? Can one country go and invest in the other country? And what are the trade laws that will be applied? So there are big question marks here, and I wish some of our colleagues who are doing environmental law will pick this up. But that's a space that is emerging, and that will define most of the things in the future. Some parting thoughts now. I think African borders are becoming more important for the new group of cartographers who are envisioning Africa into the future, and they want to shape that future. So one can just imagine how all these connectivities will come together at some point and redefine the landscapes of the continent, redefine the relationship between people and their environment. But who are these cartographers that are drawing the map? And I think there are many maps in Southern Africa. There are dream maps already that are being used to push for new ways of imagining Africa. And we have to understand the toolbox that they use. And I will say in that toolbox you'll find environmentalism. You will find environmental policies. You will find ecotourism policies. You will find new academics, new groups, generations of academics who are being trained to think in that way, who will be dedicated to ensure that these spaces happen. But there is a bigger question that we need to grapple with here. It's whether we should be spending much of the time in worrying about the borders of the past and what they've done. I know the African Union is working on the project to try and resolve some of the border issues that are historical. It becomes more important when you have got minerals or gas on the borderlines. But we should also be paying more attention to how cartography is creating new borders on Africa, and how this future is taking place through imaginations, but also in practical ways, where you end up drawing the physical borders along spaces. And I think that's for me, it's the discussion that African scholars or scholars interested in Africa should grapple with. It's what is the future that is being made here, and what are the implications for that making of Africa through environmentalism. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ramutsindela, for sharing your research with us. Very interesting. Now, my colleague, Dr. Isaac Kalumba, I think we have some questions.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome, Professor Ramutsindela, and thank you very much for that eye-opening talk that covers a wide range of historical and current issues concerning land, borders, people, commerce, politics. A very rich discussion there. Thank you so much, sir. There's a question up here, and I want to urge our audience to begin to put your questions in the Q&A area. I have the first question comes from Pabalo Chauke, and it says, can we then take it further and say that environmentalism through TFCAs, I think that refers to the Transfrontier Conservation Areas, is creating new countries and borderlines whilst worsening colonial border disputes or conflicts? There's a follow-up that says, are there new borders created through environmentalism, also neo-colonial creations? So I'll read that again. Are the new borders created through environmentalism also neo-colonial creations, since they are mainly constructed by external Western forces?
Okay, thanks. These are interesting questions. When I say who are the new cartographers, I was in some ways alluding to what these questions are speaking to. There is a view that environmentalism it's a new colonialism on the continent. And so if you take the issue of land, when people were dispossessed in the past, it was not through environmentalism. Of course, there were people who were removed to create the Kruger National Park and so forth. But what we have now is it's a very strong move to get more land. And some of the projects that are being done are actually frightening. There are people who think we should put half the world, 50% of the world should be conservation, in conservation areas or protected areas. And if one thinks where that 50% will be, much of the land in Africa will constitute that, because of the rich biodiversity the continent has. And the second question speaks to the current cartographers who are redrawing these maps. And my view is that these are externally driven. And if they are localized, you have got an elite group that is interested in drawing these maps. Some of the ideas were initially thought to be an escape route. You know, when African countries become more independent, which areas, where do you still exercise control? You can exercise control by creating these other spaces. And you have the knowledge about conservation in the way that international donor agencies will understand it. They will have the funds to be able to do it. So it's mostly externally driven, and we can trace this external factor by where the funding comes from, and some of the conditions about funding that go to countries actually have environmental protection as a condition. We will give you this foreign aid if you put so much land aside for conservation. So this is another form of control by external players.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Ramutsindela. The questions can be sent to our Q&A section, but if for any reason you're having trouble with that, you can put your question in the chat as well. But the Q&A is the place we prefer that you send your questions. There's a question here from Professor Monson, and it says, thank you for this very provocative talk, Dr. Ramutsindela. In your research on the Makulele land claim, you argued for a form of conservation that recognizes rights, contractual conservation. Is a new way to imagine rights in the environmentalist context. How would contractual conservation enter into the borderlands? Or is the point of the borderlands environmentalism to have spaces without rights?
Okay, let me try and rephrase the question so I can answer directly. So understand the question as referring to different forms of land rights that are involved in conservation spaces. So the case of Makuleke was the first restitution of land rights in the Kruger National Park, and it was quite an important land claim for people who were removed from the Kruger National Park. But then it also became important as a test case of how conservation and land reform are going to work together. The country was more interested in getting land reform as a key driver of transformation in the country, and then the land reform hit a very important area of conservation, which is the Kruger, about the first national park in the country, and one of the most enterprising on the continent. So in order to resolve the question of land rights, the Makuleke were given their land rights back, but with the condition that they should keep the conservation intact. So that becomes a contractual park. But it was the Kruger was not the first place where the contractual park took place. The first contractual park was between Namibia and South Africa in the Richtersveld. So I don't have the map. You can just imagine where Namibia and South Africa meet along the Orange River. Okay. But on the South African side, that contractual park was important for establishing a national park on the land that belonged to the Nama people. And so the Makuleke model was a refinement of what has happened already in the Richtersveld, where the first contractual park was. So with the contractual park, you have got some rights because it is your land, but there are conditions on how you can use this land. You can't go and build houses there. You can't go and, in the case of Makuleke, there were also mineral deposits. You can't license mining there because you will destroy the Kruger. So there are rights, and of course all rights are limited. and that's why we always have LTD in the companies. You know, all rights are limited. But in most cases, where these trans-frontier conservation areas are being established, most of the people don't have land rights. Interestingly, when the Nama on the South African side had the land rights, their relatives on the Namibian side did not have those rights, but yet they belong to the same same trans-frontier conservation area. And so are the Makulekas. Their relatives in Mozambique, people who speak the same language in Mozambique and in Zimbabwe, do not have those land rights that the Makuleka have. We can give as many examples as possible, and I don't think those are the kind of rights that I'm advocating for. Because if we give land rights to those who are claiming through restitution, not all countries have got restitution as a process of claiming back the land. There is no restitution in Namibia. There's no restitution in Zimbabwe as a process of land reform. But what we need to do is to think of the kinds of land rights that will give people a say in what happens to their land. The form it takes, I think, is debatable, but there should be the forms of land rights that will give people a say in what happens in their land. And if it's development, and if we follow Amartya Sen's conception of development as freedom, let's give them the freedom to decide how they want to develop. Whether they want agriculture rather than tourism, it should be their choice. Okay, I'll stop there. Maybe there are some other questions.
Yes, there are, Professor Ramutsindela. There is a question here from Ernestina, and it says, how can transnational environmentalism be perceived as a depoliticizing tool to political spaces like some of Africa's conflict-ridden territorial borderlands?
Yeah, I mean, there's a view that if you create these trans-frontier conservation areas, I mean, they are you know, they're in the public discourse, they are known as peace parks. They should be bringing peace to people who are, fighting over land, over borders, and so forth. But they're mostly in peaceful areas already. So you don't take them to where there's conflict and resolve that conflict. And of course, the logic is that, okay, we're creating them to prevent conflict because it might arise. So it's a weak argument to use peace for, peaceful resolution, because most of the conflicts are not necessarily just about the borders. They're about other things. And how you solve those conflict becomes important. So if the conflict is about land, and you take away that land and make it conservation, it means that you have taken land away from both sides who are in conflict. Whether solving that conflict by taking away their land is a good thing or not, it's debatable.
Thank you. A question from Ayokunmi Ojebode says, good evening and greetings from Nigeria. I appreciate Professor Ramutsindela's stimulating and thought-provoking presentation. What is the prospect of deploying ecofeminism, other subfields of eco-criticism, in addressing a pandemic like coronavirus?
Well, I was hoping nobody will ask me about coronavirus. But we're living, in the time of coronavirus, so we can't avoid that. I think we should use all avenues, and ecofeminism is an important avenue to look at the world differently. And actually, ecofeminism has pushed society to think differently about people, repositioning, say, women in land rights, because in most countries you still have the ownership of land being more patriarchal in terms of who takes the land after the owner has passed on and so forth, or the father has passed on. So it's still a problem. But ecofeminism has changed our mindset in many ways, and I think in our approach to the coronavirus, we need to deploy it again in ways that will help us to respond to coronavirus differently. The point that I take from the question is that perhaps the coronavirus is reinforcing some of the worldviews that we are used to, and we need to bring other ways of looking at things, other ways of solving problems, in order to improve our chances of resolving some of the challenging problems of our time. And coronavirus is a challenge to many things. And I think that if we are able to use that lens, it will help us to manage it in ways that perhaps others who are not using that lens will miss it.
Thank you. Please, if you have questions, go ahead and put them on the Q&A, and we will get them answered. If you're having any difficulty opening that Q&A section, you can put them in the chat. I have a question here from Jacob Myers, and he says, thank you so much for your talk. As a current student of GIS, I wanted to ask what steps, in your view, need to be taken to construct a liberatory discipline cartography, particularly with regard to Africa. Is such a cartography possible within the neocolonial structures of the subject matter of our maps?
Oh, that's an interesting question. And actually, GIS is behind the maps that I've just shown you. GIS has been deployed to promote these cross-border conservation areas, because you can map different layers of things, and we need GIS to map what is not being mapped. In most of these cases, you will see wildlife, you will see the rivers, you will see the forests, but how do we overlay the map of people and the activities in these areas? And I think that will be a liberatory cartography of Africa, if we can do that. But also to map where things are going. So, there are these 3 maps that have been mapped, but we haven't, many people haven't even seen them. Okay? So they can't even engage with them. What we also need to do is to begin to reimagine the continent by ourselves, without necessarily being reacting to what somebody else is doing. Are African cartographers able to, can they challenge themselves to imagine the continent differently and what it could be? And not mapping everything, but some of the things that we think we should preserve. I just imagine if somebody can produce a cartographic map of arable land on the continent, and we make sure that we don't lose arable land for our food security, and that will change the conversation about cartography. And so, to answer the question directly, cartography has been used to produce these maps that are using environmentalism, and we need a new generation of cartographers to imagine the continent differently, to imagine their countries differently, and to focus on mapping the things that are not on the maps. so that they can change the narrative and the discourse.
Thank you very much, Professor Ramutsindela. That was our last question. So I will pass it on to my colleague, Dr. Awasar.
Thank you again very much, Professor Ramutsindela. We really appreciate your spending some time with us and sharing your research with us. I think we have one more question.
Okay. Well.
Oh, no. Okay, I think you answered that. I'm sorry. That question was answered. So thank you again for coming and sharing your research with us. Thank you, everybody, also who came today. Unfortunately, next Thursday, our Eye on Africa is canceled. The speaker couldn't make it. So we'll see you the following Thursday, November 12th. Please join us. And again, Professor, thank you so much. And thank you, Isaac, also for reading the questions. And have a good afternoon or good evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you
all.
Okay.